Hi, this is Anita McGann. I wanted to give you just a brief overview of corporate strategy and talk a little bit about this issue of diversification. So corporate strategy is about participating in multiple business units and is defined as diversification across structurally different industries. So for example, General Electric manufactures large turbine generators, it manufactures jet engines, it's in the white goods business, manufacturing refrigerators and washing machines and so on, makes light bulbs, does a whole series of other additional products, makes other products and services as well. It's a diversified company. Another example that we teach in the program is on Disney. Disney's in, of course, cruise lines and sports team ownership and merchandising. But its first two big businesses, of course, are film production and those theme parks. So corporate strategy is about participating in multiple businesses, each of which has its own industry structure, its own competitive position, and it's unified under a corporate parent here. Now, the first question that you want to ask, of course, when you are thinking about corporate strategy here is, right, where really are the boundaries between the corporation and its individual business units? Business unit strategy is where profits are earned in an organization here. So business units have the P&Ls for the company here. And when you're studying business unit strategy, you're asking about the drivers of industry profitability, competitive advantage of the firm within that particular business unit, within that industry. For corporate strategy, we're asking, okay, what's the mix of the different industries that we should be in? How are we going to add value to each individual unit so that the sum is greater than the parts? Really, the philosophy of corporate strategy is to ask the question, why can't each one of these individual business units be its own company? Why can't the film business of Disney be a standalone company and the theme park be a standalone company, cruise lines be a standalone company, so on, and then have them in some sort of an alliance with each other or some sort of a maybe licensing agreement where the films come out and they license the characters to the theme parks, license some of those characters to the merchandising business or even to the cruise lines, and organize the company as separate business units. Our colleagues in finance tell us that when you bring a business unit into a corporation, you can lose as much as 20% of the value of that business by getting rid of the autonomy of the business unit, saddling it with an extra layer of overhead here. So there has to be more than a compensating benefit that comes from the organization as a whole that justifies that diversification here. The ultimate goal of corporate strategy is to create superior long-run performance for the organization by adding back more value into the individual business units than they can achieve by being on their own. And that's a pretty high bar given this 20% rule of thumb that our finance colleagues have offered us. All right, in practice, all firms have a corporate strategy. Even a single line company that is not diversified, think of great single line companies that have been, rigorously focused on doing one thing and one thing only, Home Depot, for example. That single focus is a decision. The decision not to engage in other industries is important to the company's performance as well. So every firm has a corporate strategy, even if it's as simple as saying, hey, we're only going to be in one business unit. And that's absolutely legitimate and quite common. About 50% of corporations that are publicly traded in the United States, for example, are single-line businesses. Even today in 2016. Now, CEOs are often focused on corporate strategy because it's a high-level decision, and often as well because of principal agency questions. In other words, CEOs often are interested in expanding the size of the firm, expanding their span of control. Sometimes that's very much aligned with the interests of the board of directors and the investors. Sometimes it's not. Bottom line is they're often focused on corporate strategy and diversification. leaving the business unit managers to make decisions about the competitive positioning of the organization in each of the industries in which it participates. Bad corporate strategy decisions are quite common here, and they give rise to an industry of corporate rating and hedge funds. Sometimes this is the idea that corporate raters are going to go in and try to take control of the shares of a corporation that has unjustifiable diversification. Hedge funds will bet against companies that have pursued bad corporate strategies here. I'll get into that as we go forward here. Because corporate strategy is less well understood than business unit strategy, can often be a source of advantage for companies, but less so now than it has been in the past. Achieving a premium on your price, on your stock price through corporate strategy is more and more difficult over time because of the availability of better and better information about the value that you're giving up by preventing these different business units from being independent. All right, let me say a couple of words here about the different dimensions of corporate strategy. The first is what we're calling horizontal diversification. This is expansion into multiple businesses that share inputs, but that don't sell directly to one another. So for example, at Disney, the theme parks, the animated films, and the consumer products all get their characters from the firm's Imagineering R&D activity. So the corporation runs an R&D lab that creates characters, and those characters are available to the theme parks, the animated film divisions, and the consumer products divisions, but there's no selling of product or services directly between the film divisions and the theme parks and the consumer products divisions. The corporation is providing an input. In this case, it's an intangible resource of a character that can be used in the different business units of the company here. Contrast that with vertical integration, which occurs when a corporation is involved in different businesses that make inputs for other units here. And that can occur both upstream and downstream here. So the idea here is that backward or upstream integration occurs when a manufacturing firm supplies its own raw materials or components, often in competition with outside vendors or suppliers that can provide the same kinds of goods and services. For example, Anheuser-Busch can make its own aluminum cans. I think the word is that Anheuser-Busch would rather purchase those cans from an outside supplier, but it has the capacity to make its own aluminum cans so that it can effectively compete with those outside suppliers here. And then forward integration occurs when a manufacturing firm or any other kind of firm moves into its own customer base. So markets or distributes directly by engaging in activities that normally or previously it had left to independent companies, becoming its own distributor, becoming its own marketing firm, becoming its own wholesaler, even retailer, getting closer and closer to that consumer. So backward integration is into supply, and forward integration is into your buyer's business here. The Disney Corporation has done that here. When it bought Pixar Films, it backward integrated into the film production business, and then it could take those Pixar films and distribute them through the Disney Channel and through other mechanisms such as the Disney stores. Take those Pixar film characters and make merchandise out of those characters that it would then resell in those stores. So that's an example from Disney of both backward integration and forward integration here. All right, and then the final dimension of corporate strategy is international expansion here. Expansion into multiple geographic markets to leverage investments from the corporate whole also represents diversification. This is actually a kind of horizontal diversification, but it's worth calling out independently because it's so pervasive in some organizations. For Disney, they have theme parks in Paris, course, Disney World in the United States and Shanghai Disney in China. So it'd be international expansion, again, a form of horizontal diversification. There are some instances where international expansion does not involve going into structurally different businesses. For example, in the global pharmaceutical industry, international expansion often leads you to compete with the same rivals, to rely on the same suppliers, sometimes even rely on the same distributors. Downstream consumers will be different, but the distributors might be the same. If you've got the same customers in those distributors, the same suppliers, the same rivals, then it's not really diversification, because the internationalization doesn't take you into structurally different industries here. So international expansion, it's a common form of horizontal diversification, but international expansion doesn't always involve horizontal diversification. Okay. Poor corporate strategy is common. This is an old example. It comes from more than 20 years ago, the Financial Times here, but it's one that Brian Silverman and I found some years ago we were very excited about here. This is from the Financial Times in May of 1998. There was a statement that Excite, one of the leading internet service companies, rejected a takeover offer from Zapata, which is a Texas-based group with holdings in marine protein and food packaging companies. Marine protein, that's fish protein. Food packaging sounds like a manufacturing-intensive business where it's making packaging here. It's hard to understand that there would be a relationship either on terms of achieving horizontal or vertical relationships between marine protein and internet, or food packaging and internet. So it looks like the justification here is really reflected in the chief executive officer's kind of personal ambitions here. The next quote says that, citing the excellent fit with Zapata's new strategic direction, this fellow Avram Glazer, the chief executive officer, said the proposed transaction makes sense for shareholders because of the capital resources that Zapata can bring to Excite. That means that Zapata had money that Excite needed. Well, exchanging money between organizations is a very poor reason to diversify here. If a company needs money, it would be better off borrowing that money from Zapata, or better yet, from a financial institution or from some sort of a financial arrangement with its own stakeholders, including its own debt or equity holders here, than it would be being acquired here. You're saddling the internet business of Excite with an extra layer of overhead. There's no synergies between the three different businesses. It's hard to understand how Zapata would benefit Excite other than by providing cash, and a 20% loss of Excite's value in order to exchange money between two organizations seems like too high a price to pay on the face of it. So this looks like it doesn't make a ton of sense for corporate strategy and for Zapata's investors here. There's some more examples here. These are meant to be a bit funny. This shows a barber shop that has integrated into the gun business. Hard to say. Let's see, what would be the relationship between a barber? I guess if I got a bad haircut, well, let's not go down that path. Here's another one, paintball and food storage. That actually seems like it might have diseconomies of scope, where the paintball business might actually damage the food storage business, or even the violin business here. Poor corporate strategy. Here's another one. This is a little bit funny. It's for a funeral parlor that hosts mini golf games on days in which there's no funeral work. It says free inside mini golf. Call ahead because play is canceled if there's any funeral work. I guess I can see that there's a common resource there, which is the physical infrastructure of the building, but holy cow, it looks like you would be diminishing the reputation of the funeral home if you were playing mini golf in it, and it's hard to enjoy mini golf if what you're doing is playing around in a funeral home. By contrast, here's an example of a company that had a very rational diversification strategy. They started out in the milk pasteurization business some time ago, 1893, diversified into ice cream, cheese. We see over here Hydrix ice cream as well, a product of National Dairy. That all looks like it makes sense here. Continuing diversification, well, yeah, getting into dry yeast, I suppose I can see that relationship. You make milk and ice cream. Maybe this is diversification into to breads, which are highly reliant, of course, on dairy products. Now we're getting into herbal teas. That seems like a little further afield. Now, Rubbermaid and batteries. Maybe there's a sharing of the distribution channels, but clearly this horizontal diversification is getting further and further afield here. So the premises of corporate strategy are, again, the competition is occurring down at that business unit level, that being part of a diversified company involves inevitable costs for those business units that are often underestimated. I've given you that 20% rule of thumb here. One of the most substantial costs of acquisition here is in human resources here. When you acquire a new business, there's often an underestimation of what the employees will do ex post. Many of the employees of the acquired firm may quit, for example. Their desire had been to work, let's say, for a small entrepreneurial startup, not for a larger firm. So, it's easy to underestimate the costs associated with post-merger integration here. There's also got to be a clear sort of diversification, a clear understanding of how diversification is going to affect the incentives of the management team to engage in various investments as well here. This chart now shows a picture of a young entrepreneur in a biotech company that gets acquired by a big pharmaceutical firm. Prior to the acquisition, this fellow was working for his own account. Now he's got to do his research for a big pharmaceutical company's benefit here. Will he work as intensively as he did previously? It may be that his incentives have been blunted. There has to be a clear and offsetting gain in the competitive advantage of the business units that exceeds available alternative governance structures. What does this mean? This is kind of a fancy and complicated sentence. What we're saying here is that if you bring together two business units under the same corporate umbrella, there has to be that benefit that goes from the corporation down to the business unit that exceeds what could be accomplished if those business units were separate companies and had a contract or an alliance that allowed them to work together without being owned together here. One very, very interesting example of companies that did not achieve this same kind of competitive advantage are companies that were independent in filmmaking, theme parks, and consumer products after both Universal and Disney diversified into all three businesses here. So if you're independent in one of these three different businesses, and you're competing directly with Disney or Universal, say in Orlando or out in California, it's very difficult for you to be effective because of the synergies that each of these two companies had achieved by virtue of the relationships between the different companies, the different segments here. So, there are examples of very interesting competitive dynamics when large diversified firms like, say, Kraft and General Mills, or Disney and Universal, or General Electric and Rolls-Royce for a time, here, United Technologies, when firms diversify into different businesses and share that scope and compete in multiple businesses, here can really leave the independent firms at a disadvantaged position here. So that's an important consideration in corporate strategy here. We should add that shareholders can diversify themselves at low cost in many economies. So for example, if I own a share of stock in Zapata, I can buy a share of stock in Excite. I don't need Zapata to buy Excite if I'm warm to the prospects for Excite to achieve competitive advantage. I can diversify myself at a much lower cost. In fact, the cost of buying a share of stock is about $9 if you have a good broker. This is much cheaper than the 20% loss of value on the company if you allow the original firm Zapata to actually go after that diversification, that unrelated diversification on its own. You can diversify as well to smooth earnings as a independent shareholder here. So if you've got two different business units that are each counter-cyclical, there's no reason that they have to be owned by the same corporate parent. They can be separate and then lend money to each other or work through a bank in order to transfer resources, and the shareholders in those organizations can diversify by buying stock in those organizations to achieve diversification. So diversifying to smooth risk or smooth cash flow is rarely an advantage. So the central issue here is, how can a corporation make its businesses more competitive by guiding what mix of businesses the company is in and by dictating how the businesses are integrated here? How can you do that as effectively as possible here? Well, it turns out to justify an increase in corporate scope, either horizontally, vertically, or internationally, you have to pass two tests, and these tests are called the Better Off test and the Ownership test. The Better Off test asks the following question. It says, does the presence of the corporation in a given market improve the total competitive advantage of those two business units over and above what they could achieve on their own or in their next best use? So that's the Better Off test. The Better Off test is saying, are each of the individual businesses better off than what they could achieve on their own in their next best, given their next best alternative here? Now, the Better Off test is just the first of two tests, and it's a low bar because being better off is not enough to justify that this particular corporation should be the one that diversifies here. To pass the second test, the ownership test, you have to have an acceptable answer to the question, does the combined ownership of the business units produce a greater competitive advantage than if they were either owned by some other company or if they were organized together under an alternative contractual arrangement like a arm's length contract or an alliance. In other words, if there were two different business units that were being brought together under a particular company, you ask the question, why should this company own those two business units? We know they're better off working together than they would be independently, but why should this company be the one that pulls them together as compared to another company? And then secondly, do we have to have them owned by a company at all, or could they just set up some sort of an alliance between them or some sort of a long-term contract that they're going to help each other out that would allow them to be even more competitive than they are when they're owned by the owner that's seeking to pass this test. A few more words on the Better Off test. The idea here is you increase the total competitive advantage of the combined business units. And there's two ways to do this. The first is economies of scope, which is really just a technical way of saying, hey, the costs of the two different business units are lower than they would be if the two organizations were independent. So think of, for example, Walmart owning both Sam's Clubs and discount stores. And by sharing those distribution centers and the distribution systems, the costs of each of those two organizations is lowered here. It's the sharing of the capabilities and the resources that have that allows them to lower the cost. So the cost of Sam's Clubs, which is represented by YI, and the discount retailing unit, which is represented by YJ, is less than the cost of each of the individual business units operating separately here. In general, sharing of capabilities and resources that have high fixed development costs, like putting in a distribution center, is kind of a big upfront cost. Once you have it there, it's less expensive to run. That high development cost here is what allows you to have lower total costs across the two individual business units. Many other examples that come to mind are in creative industries like the pharmaceutical business or the film production business, where you have these long-term investments in to develop a drug or to develop a character, Once that character or that drug is developed, then we want to try to sell that the services that new asset can support in multiple businesses, such as for Disney in the theme parks, in the films, through the merchandising, and even through branding and activities on those cruise ships. In the pharmaceutical business, you want to take that drug and introduce it into multiple markets at the same time so that you can amortize those development costs. Investing in relationship-specific investments also can lead to lower costs. So here we have an example of vertical integration giving rise to an economy of scope. A relationship-specific investment is the tailoring of a product or process to lower the costs in the combined business unit. So an example of this that's very famous of a relationship-specific investment occurs when you have a mine. This comes from Paul Jasko's work at MIT. You have a mine that has an opening. The opening to the mine is in a remote area, let's say in a mountainous area. You want to get the ore that comes out of that mine down into a railroad track that, let's say, is in the valley that's several miles away. One idea would be that you would put in a rail spur that would connect the railroad to the mine. But if you do that as the railroad and then try to negotiate the price on that railroad ex post, or in this example, recovery of the cost of that railroad ex post, the mine itself might say, hey, that's a sunk cost now. We really don't want to pay for that. So in advance, anticipating being held up like that, the railroad might say, hey, we're not really that interested in building a rail spur, forcing the mine owner to actually, let's say, go with a costlier option of trucking the ore down to the railroad there. Well, you can get the lower cost option of actually creating that rail spur if, let's say, the railroad buys the mine. If the railroad buys the mine, then that cost of building the rail spur is internalized in the company, and the total cost of actually getting the ore out of the mine and into into civilization on the rail spur and then connecting into the railroad becomes reduced because there's an alignment of interests between the railroad and the mine that wasn't there when there were two independent companies there. All right, so that's the second example of an economy of scope. The third example of an economy of scope has to do with coordinating activities across businesses to reduce their cost. Let's see, an example of coordinating activities to reduce costs would occur, let's say, in a university that schedules its classes in the same buildings and runs its schedules around a time of year when the different programs are not in competition for that space. So economies of scope can be pretty diverse in their character. The bottom line, what connects them together, is that the costs of running the two businesses by the same company are less than the costs of running them separately. The second type of benefit that can allow an organization to pass the better off test has to do with cross-selling benefits. And here the idea is that you increase willingness to pay through joint ownership above what could be achieved by having each of the two business units as separate companies here. So, for example, if you value a one-stop shop for multiple products, create willingness to pay benefits. Here, this is the idea that you go to one place to get all the things that you need in one particular trip, and that makes you willing to pay a little bit more if you have to for each one of the individual products. It's this idea of convenience. Go to one place, and that increases my willingness to pay. Sometimes my willingness to pay goes up because of the reputation for quality developed across businesses, such as when Microsoft diversified from operating systems into application software. Company has two different products. The reputation in one area spills over into the other area and enhances willingness to pay in the second line of business. So better off test is, one way or another, either through reducing costs or increasing revenue, the two business units are better off being together under the same corporate umbrella than they were separately. Okay, the ownership test is actually more complicated than the Better Off test, because this involves understanding creatively whether or not the particular company that seeks to own two business units actually is the best owner of those two business units available here. So there are always contractual alternatives as well to common ownership, the idea of licensing and alliances that I had mentioned previously here. Ownership tests asks, is the corporation that's in charge the best corporation to be in charge? And do we need corporate ownership at all? Or could this be achieved at arm's length? Now, contracting takes a number of different forms here, and this dashed line represents the range of possible alternatives here. Way at the right-hand side is common ownership. That's ownership of the two business units by a single firm. Way on the left-hand side is arm's length market exchanges, where we have two different business units that are simply selling to one another. So, for example, you have one independent company, the coal company, selling, let's say, the coal to the railroad, and then the railroad has to solve the problem of transporting that coal into civilization here. There are intermediate alternatives as well. On the right-hand side, an equity joint venture where the two different business units form companies and then swap stock, create a joint venture between them. The middle of this is an alliance where we have a long-term contract together, perhaps take equity stakes that are minority stakes. On the left-hand side, medium or long-term contracts where we pledge to work together in the medium or medium or long run here. Now, each one of these alternatives has its downsides, and each has its benefits here. The costs of each of these alternatives are called contracting costs here. And what you've got to do is weigh the contracting costs against the contracting benefits in each of these alternatives here. Let me focus on the two remote alternatives here, common ownership versus arm's length market exchanges, or perhaps medium and long-term contracts here, because they represent the greatest contrast here. But there's a lot worth studying in terms of understanding alliances and equity joint ventures as well. So I'll be focusing right now on the two extremes, but I want to acknowledge that there's a middle ground as well. Okay, the question for the ownership test is can amount to, how do we know when contracting costs are likely to be high? How do we know when it's likely to be justified that it's going to be hard to have an arm's length transaction, and therefore common ownership is justified here? Got some notes here that the costs of using market alternatives for here include the costs of finding a qualified partner, negotiating, writing and renegotiating that contract, as well as dealing with the cost of opportunism, which basically is the cost associated with being vulnerable to hold up or free riding or shirking in the arrangement here. That kind of opportunism occurs when one side to a transaction makes a commitment, and then by virtue of that commitment, the other side can take advantage. So, for example, I buy a specialized piece of equipment to sell you a particular good or service. Once I buy that specialized piece of equipment that can only be used to serve you, you take advantage of me because you know that I got nothing better that I can do with that. So that's opportunism. It's sometimes called hold up, in the sense of stick 'em up or I'll shoot. You know, I got nothing I can do with this piece of equipment after I buy it, then serve you, and you can take advantage of me as a result of that commitment here. Now, contracting costs tend to be higher, and the ownership test is therefore, more likely to be passed when there are these high relationship-specific investments, and when the two sides are sharing a lot of intangible or knowledge-intensive resources here. So again, high relationship-specific investments. Let me give you a couple of examples here. Let's imagine that I'm this is very unlikely, but let's imagine that I'm a minor league baseball player. I'm eligible to participate on a farm team for a baseball team in North America or Japan. I have to put in 4 or 5 years of, really refining my skills as a baseball player in order to be eligible for the major leagues. Once I put in all that effort, I forego going to college, I'm committed to baseball, then I don't have very much negotiating power over my salary ex post. And that's why baseball has created a union to protect young players, not to mention the more senior players, but especially to protect young players from holdup. Because once I make that commitment of the 4 or 5 years of development as a minor league player, then I don't have very much negotiating power anymore over my salary if I'm eligible for the big leagues because of holdup or opportunism here. Another example would be buying a piece of equipment, as I mentioned. Sometimes my students get stuck in a situation of opportunism when they rent an apartment, let's say for 3 years, their first 3 years of study, and then they go in to negotiations with their landlords for their 4th and final year of study, and the landlord wants to raise the rent a lot. Well, the landlord is being opportunistic. We know that those students enjoy living in those apartments. They've got a good roommate deal. They only have 1 year to go. Moving is a drag. So the landlord is anticipating that the willingness to pay of those students to stay in those apartments is higher because of relationship-specific investments to that apartment, and the landlord is trying to take advantage of that. Okay, so whenever you have these situations of asymmetric investment across both sides of a transaction, in this case, the students investing and living in that apartment for 3 years, or the baseball player putting in the 4 or 5 years of training, or the manufacturing firm buying a specific piece of equipment that can only be used for one thing. In each of those examples, one side is investing in advance of the other, and that makes you vulnerable in bargaining, reduces the value of outside options, and thus increases the risk of holdup. And that creates a situation where ownership may make more sense. Okay? For example, the piece of specialized equipment is owned by the buyer rather than the supplier of those manufacturing services. The baseball team actually contracts for the services of the baseball player before the 5 years of work are put in the minor leagues, or a student leases the apartment for the entire 4 years rather than for only a year at a time. Each one of these things has its disadvantages as well, as I mentioned earlier here, but the idea would be that you want to try to create integration over those transactions in situations of relationship-specific investments. Another situation where the ownership test is met is where there's a lot of sharing of intangibles here. Now, it's difficult to describe in a contract all of the rights and responsibilities associated with knowledge. How do I write that down? Knowledge is something that you have, I don't have. I'm trying to work with you as a collaborator, as a business partner, because you have knowledge about something that I don't understand. I can't write a contract that actually specifies your responsibilities to provide that knowledge to me very easily here. There's another reason as well, which is it's difficult to observe actions. Think of if you're a scientist and I'm hiring you to do a specific piece of research, and I'm hiring you because of your expertise. There's moral hazard in that situation in the sense that, I can't really tell if you're trying hard because I don't know enough about the science that you're doing to be able to evaluate you. In other words, for the very reason that I've hired you to do this scientific work for me, I can't tell if you're doing good science or not. And that creates vulnerability. The way to solve those problems, you have the scientist own the partnership opportunity. Okay? You have whoever has the knowledge actually own both sides of that transaction, and the ownership test is met. All right. When is horizontal diversification likely to generate value? When is it likely to destroy value? All right. On the left-hand side, I've got some situations where we've got common answers to why we've diversified, but they're not really very good answers. They're problematic. First one is diversification smooths earnings. It's not a very good reason to diversify. The shareholders can do that for themselves in developed economies, and it's expensive to bring two business units together. The second is that diversification enables a firm to move cash or people among different business units here. Again, not a good reason to horizontally diversify. The costs of diversification, tend to be pretty high here. Some better answers here are that diversification permits a firm to maybe use excess resources. Like if Walmart had excess capacity in those distribution centers, it makes sense that it would open Sam's Clubs so that it could achieve those economies of scope. The question is, does the firm have to diversify to do that, or maybe could it contract them out? Could Walmart have contracted out use of its distribution center to a rival? Probably pretty unlikely that it would have wanted to do that for a whole range of reasons, including exposing some of the mechanics of its distribution centers. So, Walmart's ownership of both the discount retailing stores and Sam's Clubs becomes justified. Another good reason to diversify horizontally, it enables coordination across units, such as cross-selling. So, you've got a bank that's offering wealth management services as well as, let's say, mortgage products, so investment services as well as loans. If you coordinate across those two business units, you can actually do a better job for your customer by allowing them to understand, for example, some of the tax and investment, long-term investment implications of redeploying resources across the portfolio there. That's a good reason why diversification makes sense here. And again, the question is there some other arrangement, like a contract between two businesses that can achieve the same coordination at a lower cost? If the bank could basically do a partnership with a wealth management organization, lend money to somebody to buy a home and then work together collaboratively with an outside investment manager to help that person manage, say, their retirement assets, then diversification would not be justified. But for most banks, it's pretty difficult to achieve an arm's length relationship that can generate the same benefits for the client as a more heavily coordinated interaction within the bank here. So again, most banks will offer both of those types of products. On the vertical side, boy, it's easy to get pushed off base here. On the left-hand side, here are some common but problematic answers to the question, when is vertical integration likely to generate value? Integration into a supplying industry allows a firm to stabilize input prices. That's a bad answer. This is a little counterintuitive. Let me see if I can explain this efficiently here. So let's imagine that I'm Anheuser-Busch and I can make my own cans. Well, can prices are low, let's say, outside. I could buy outside here. I could buy cans outside. Can prices are high. I could buy cans inside. Well, the problem here is this may look good, but I'm locked in both situations. So, and it's also not clear that I'm going to actually be as efficient in making cans as some of the outside alternatives. So it may be that when prices are low, my prices internally are not as low as the outside firms, meaning that I should shut down production, and that when prices are high on the outside, that my prices may be even higher than everybody else's, because perhaps the reason that those prices of manufacturing cans are higher because the stock aluminum that goes into them has become more expensive. So the problem is that if I don't have a competitive advantage in the can making business, there are limits to the advantage that I can have in the main beer business by relying on that can business. I'm better off buying on the competitive market from firms that have advantages and raising the price if I have to on my beer to reflect the increased input prices here. So stabilizing input prices is usually not a good reason to vertically integrate. Another bad reason to vertically integrate is that integration permits the firm to capture the margin that a supplier or buyer is getting. It's extraordinary how frequently students sometimes get caught in this trap here. They think, oh, let me just get my hands on that margin. But that margin is earned by the supplier or buyer because it has a competitive advantage, it's doing something that's very effective here. The supplier or the buyer may not really be getting a margin above its cost of capital in the first place, and we don't know whether or not that efficiency is going to persist. In addition to that, even if they did, generally I would have to pay an acquisition price that reflects the net present value of that improvement in margins. In other words, if I'm going to backward integrate and purchase a supplier in order to capture the margin, the purchase price to actually get my hands on that should reflect the net present value of the cost of that margin. All right, here's some better answers. Integration encourages firms to make those relationship-specific investments. For example, Fisher Auto Body used to stamp out the auto bodies that were purchased by General Motors here, and the quality of those molds depended on Fisher Body actually making molds that were really precisely those required by General Motors. Well, Fisher Body was run by a group of executives that, anticipated that General Motors might take advantage of Fisher Body if it actually made these investments. So, there was underinvestment in those relationship-specific assets. It's like the railroad tie never being built, in the other example from a few minutes ago. So what happened? General Motors bought Fisher Body. Once that happens, the incentives are aligned, and Fisher Body actually makes more relationship-specific investments, and we get more value created through the combination. So that's a good reason to vertically integrate. Another reason to vertically integrate, it enables the sharing of intangible resources like the Disney characters. We don't want those Disney characters slapped on to all sorts of crazy stuff like coffee mugs and flimsy paper cups. We want the Disney stores to offer high quality merchandise that reflects the quality of the Mickey Mouse brand, for example. Well, the sharing of those intangible resources and preserving their value requires that Disney owns both the stores and the generation of the value of the character there. So the idea here is the best answers give us an affirmative response to this key question here, which is that this arrangement of collaborative ownership is better than any other approach like a contract or an alliance. If other arrangements achieve the same coordination at lower cost or at higher value for buyers, then you can't justify collaborative ownership. All right, geographic expansion here. Some bad answers on the left side. If a firm is in a business where the industry is actually saturated or there's no more growth opportunity, geographic expansion increases growth. Well, the problem here is unless the expansion can pass the ownership test and the better off test, there's a problem here. If an industry structure in one geography is saturated, it's likely to be saturated in another geography. So you have to make sure that the geographic expansion actually is going to generate more profits and not just bigger sales. Here's another one. Geographic expansion smooths earnings and lowers risk. By now you know this is not a good idea. Shareholders can diversify for themselves by purchasing stock in separate companies here. On the right-hand side, we have some better answers, which is that, for example, geographic expansion permits a firm to use its excess resources to reduce the cost of producing for customers in new markets, such as when you have to develop a new drug or any sort of scientific instrument. Here, do that in Canada, and then I can sell that same instrument in the United States for lower cost because I don't have the development expense in the United States. Another answer, second bullet point, that geographic expansion can increase willingness to pay. You've got some customers who observe the success of the company in a different geography and say, hey, we want that too. We would like that here in our country. Their willingness to pay goes up as a result of that reputation that's initially earned in the originating country here. The third one, the geographic expansion, gives the firm some sources of knowledge and skills that make the new operations more efficient. Fourth one here, you can take advantage of factor cost differences. These are raw material differences across the world. So, for example, let's say you've got a firm that uses a lot of aluminum that's operating in the United States. If it can achieve scale by operating both in the United States, let's say, and in Europe, get a larger purchasing volume of aluminum, comes to a country like Canada or Australia, purchase aluminum in bulk, to serve both those markets, then its factor costs of aluminum go down. The key question here is really the same as the one for either vertical or horizontal diversification, which is there any other arrangement like a contract or an alliance that would allow us to achieve the same coordination at a lower cost? Could we have two companies that are in two different geographies that collaborate to purchase that aluminum together at a lower cost, or do we have to be collaboratively owned? Okay, that's the bottom line on corporate scope. Thank you very much for your attention.